So what do you guys think the cutoff is between movie and a sequel to that movie? Because I feel like the new trend now is taking older movies and giving them most of the time what seems to be unnecessary sequels. You know, Top Gun, it just happened, and I feel like bringing the Scream franchise back into things after it had been dead for basically over 10 years, it seems that Hollywood is starting to quote-unquote run out of ideas that they don't even want to reboot franchises anymore. They want to do what's called a requel, where they reboot the franchise, but yet they somehow connect it to the movies that came before it, and sometimes it can be years after the fact, as the current longest gap in between sequels is actually Disney's Bambi, as the first movie came out August 13th of 1942, and the second movie didn't come out until February 7th of 2006. So when the first movie came out, my grandparents were, little kids. By the time the second movie came out, I was a 7 going on 8-year-old kid. Now, to be honest with you, I didn't know Bambi had a sequel. I always watched the original. That's like the classic. And then, of course, Fantasia. That took 59 years from 1940 to 1999 to make the sequel. You'd be surprised. I'm going to link this article here in the description below so you guys can look at it. It's called Everpedia, where it lists the longest gaps between film and sequel. There's some films on here that I didn't even realize had sequels, probably because they were so bad that most people just forget about it. I mean, who remembers Psycho getting a proper sequel? Like, I remember the original 1960 Hitchcock film, and of course the remake with, was it Vince Vaughn? But apparently in 1983, Psycho 2 came out, directed by not Alfred Hitchcock, and I guess just didn't do well because, again, I don't even recall it ever happening. Then I completely forgot about movies like Dumb and Dumber, which that took almost 20 years to get a proper sequel. I know that Dumb and Dumber 2 is technically the third movie for Dumb and Dumber, but I think the one that came out, which I think was Dumb and Dumberer, was a prequel to the original movie, so that doesn't count as a sequel. That's more a prequel than anything. And of course, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace and Superman Returns, that took 18, almost 19 years. However, if you watch Superman Returns, I believe you're only supposed to watch or follow the first two movies and ignore what happened in 3 and 4. At least that's what I've been told. You basically get my point here with Hollywood and sequels. It was like back then, when people wanted sequels to these popular movies, we never really seemed to get it unless it was like a huge franchise. But nowadays, it seems like these older films are getting the sequel that we have been waiting a long time for. Again, this may not seem proper, but in 1978, Mel Brooks released a film called History of the World Part 1, and he put the Part 1 in there as a joke, as it was never intended to have a sequel, but yet here we are in 2023, and okay, it didn't get a movie, but it became a Hulu original series, 4 nights, 8 episodes, and it's done pretty well for itself, despite Mel Brooks being 96 now, and his comedy being a little bit outdated for some people's liking. He did definitely, still stuck with the comedy that everyone loves from him, but also kind of, still had to gain a new audience, so he brought in some writers that I guess would get the comedy from people today, and it actually turned out pretty well. And we're also talking the same thing with shows, like that 70s show got the That 90s Show spinoff, which is basically just, so far down the line from, now we're looking at the original cast kids and what they're getting into, and that did very well on Netflix as well. But now, for the reason that we are here, and that is because one of Tim Burton's most beloved movies, Beetlejuice, is finally getting the sequel. It has officially been greenlit, with Winona Ryder and Michael Keaton officially returning for their roles. And Tim Burton, of course, is going to be directing the movie. And it's interesting to me because the sequel has been pitched for years. I mean, Michael Keaton has always been in on doing it, and if you know something about Tim Burton, he doesn't necessarily like to make sequels to his movies. As a matter of fact, I still think to this day, the only one that he's made a sequel for with his movies is Batman, when he did Batman in 1989 and Batman Returns in 1992. And even Batman Returns, he was hesitant to make because, again, he just doesn't believe in making sequels for his movies. So I guess when Beetlejuice was successful, maybe it was him that was like, I don't want to do a sequel, there's no point in doing it. But now here we are in 2023, and I still don't know the timetable for when this thing's supposed to be out, but I believe the original came out in 1988, so we're looking at over 35 years since the original came out to when the sequel will actually get released. And it just blows my mind because, again, we recently saw this with Hocus Pocus. The first movie came out, what, 1992? And about 30 years later, we got the crappy sequel that came out on Disney+.
You're wrong!
Okay, that might be a little harsh. I don't think it was terrible, but I feel like with a lot of these sequels, it's always the fear of underachieving, because when these movies came out back then long ago, they had a certain audience of that time that they were trying to, pander to, and now that, that audience has grown up and you got a younger audience, now you kind of have to go both ways in pandering to the original audience and pandering to the new audience in some way. Like I said, Top Gun Maverick just did it, except for the fact that they basically made the same movie twice, and it was equally as popular the first time.
Why you booing me? I'm right!
And I think this is only happening because of Tim Burton's success with Wednesday, that series on Netflix. Because if you look at Tim Burton's past projects that came out before that, from like 2010 and on, they've been a bit underwhelming and underachieving. That I think at first Warner Brothers was very hesitant to, pull the trigger on a Beetlejuice sequel. So my guess is that because of the success of that show, Warner Brothers decided, alright, it's time to officially greenlight this. And of course, some of the original cast returning, there's room for a new cast. I mean, again, you gotta pander to the newer audience and put in actors and actresses that they know. And since they worked together on the Wednesday Addams series, Jenna Ortega is now the first in line to play Winona Ryder's character, Lydia's daughter. If she turns it down, then Sadie Sink is going to be offered that role, which I think either one would fit very well, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't necessarily think I have a preference for who plays who. I think they'll both do a great job, but again, we'll see. It seems like it's Jenna's job, but unless she turns it down, that's the only way Sadie Sink is going to get the job in the first place. So let me know in the comments below, who do you think would be the better fit in that situation? I guess my point here is, it's fine to have sequels for movies. I feel like if there's always a way to build your story from beginning to end, then do so. Now, I don't like when it starts getting to 5 movies and 6 movies, heck, even 4 movies can be a little bit. It's probably why I don't really even pay attention to the Fast and the Furious series, because you got the 10th movie coming out, and you had a spin-off called Hobbs and Shaw, and it's just like, that's too much to follow. And even with, I guess, a movie like Harry Potter, you can kind of understand why they had 8 movies, because it was 7 books, and they had to split the last book into 2 parts. Like, that's kind of understandable. But when it's just a franchise you create from scratch, it becomes a little bit too overblown, especially when you don't change much about it. Like, people complain about episodes 7, 8, 9 of Star Wars, but to be honest with you, they brought in a new story, and yeah, they had to bring back some of the old characters, but at the same point in time, it was a whole band of, adventure and just doing different things, even though I do still feel like that episode 7 is pretty much the exact copy of episode 4, but hey, who am I to judge? But most of the time when we think of sequels coming out, we think every 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, sometimes even 5 years. I mean, we're getting a Joker sequel next year, and that would be 5 years to the date that the original came out. And you look at the MCU, a lot of the sequels to their movies and characters are becoming longer and longer because they're planning these other movies ahead of it, but they have an excuse because they have a full-blown universe built out of it. I mean, from what? The first Doctor Strange to the second Doctor Strange, it took about 5-6 years. And from the last Avengers movie, which was Endgame, to the next, which is Kang Dynasty, I believe it'll be 6 or 7 years in between those. But again, they have to set everything up with other stories and other characters that they kind of have an excuse to do so. It's not that they're just intentionally waiting long enough for it to become nostalgic again. They just have a story. Now that I think about it, both Marvel and DC have explored their multiverse, or are exploring their multiverse to a deeper extent, that we're kind of starting to live on nostalgia. I mean, Spider-Man No Way Home did it, and The Flash is about to do it too. With these movies that are getting these sequels, it feels unnecessary. Like, am I happy that Beetlejuice is finally getting its sequel? Yes. Did I think it needed a sequel? No, probably not, because I feel like there's only so much you can do with those characters in particular and the story that you can tell that it would just become over repetitive. Like I said, I think that's what happened with Hocus Pocus sequel, was that the first movie was so great, it did its thing, that there was no way they could top that or even match that. And now having to kind of, you know, gain a newer audience, a younger audience, they kind of had to do some things differently, and it just didn't feel right at that time. Like, had they had made the movie back when they did and then 2 or 3 years later released a sequel, I felt like that could have been better, but releasing it about 30 years after the first one, it just kind of was like, okay, at this point, the whole thing's stale. We really don't need this. Like, the original's such a classic. Why don't we just leave it alone? But Hollywood's fascination, again, it's that nostalgia that's really pushing through here, and I think that could become a problem for the movie scene in general. For now, I'm kind of skeptical. I really am kind of skeptical, because it's like the same thing with the Joker movie. Even though it's only 5 years in between the first and the second, I felt like on its own, it was a great standalone and an origin story to a character that never really had an origin, so you could do really whatever you wanted with that, and I think it was done very, very well. But a sequel seems a little much to me, but there's always continuation that you could tell with it. So I'm gonna wait and see what happens before, again, I judge that sequel and be like, oh, it's unnecessary, because maybe there's an idea out there that works so well that they decided, hey, let's try this out, even after I think it wasn't even supposed to get a sequel in the first place. It was never intended to, but sometimes things change in this case. Anyway, I've rambled on for too long. I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about this whole, you know, sequel thing with Hollywood, especially when it's ones that after 30, 40 years of the original movie being out, they finally decide to pull the trigger and make a sequel for nostalgic reasons. Like, again, I understand if there's a universe created, that's fine, but other than that, not every movie needs a sequel, and I think we can all agree to that. It would be like if they gave the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once or Last Night in Soho a sequel when it's not needed. Those movies served their purpose, they told their point. Making a second one would just be pretty much outrageous, because you're not going to match what you were able to do with the original movies unless somehow you come up with another story to tell, and that's pretty much near impossible. But yeah, that's it for me. Stay safe out there, and until then, I will catch you all in the next one.
Dad, I'm running away!
Dawson, what are you doing?
You said you don't want me, I'm leaving.
Dawson, I never said I didn't love you.
Yes, you did.
I said turn off your PlayStation, it's time for bed. It's not the same thing. Get in here.